Okay, hello everybody and welcome to the second IBD and Tea, a live debate organized by the New Deal project. New Deal is a research project funded by the European Commission, focusing on the development of a new therapy for inflammatory bowel disease. My name is Kira Keini. I will be moderating today's event. I work at the communications company ScienceSeed, which is one of the partners of the New Deal project. And today we'll be discussing something extremely topical, how to build trust in new treatments, as well as how clinical trials and the medicine development process in general works. And of course, as the world is currently waiting for the coronavirus vaccine, what better moment than now to shed light onto on the path of a treatment from the lab to the market and address some of the concerns that people might have regarding these topics. And of course, the topic is extremely important and very relevant for IBD and many other illnesses as well. So I'm joined today by three experts on the topic. Presenting the New Deal project, we have Professor Alan Boyd, Director and Founder of Boyd's Consultants, a UK-based consultancy providing expertise in the development of pharmaceutical and biotechnology medicinal products. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you very much.
And our second guest is Tina Aswani Omprakash. She's a US-based Crohn's patient with personal experience from clinical trials. Tina's also a patient advocate for chronic illnesses and disabilities, as well as a speaker and the author of the blog Own Your Crohn's. Welcome, Tina. Great to have you with us. And our third speaker is Dr. Fernando Gomollon. He specializes in IBD at the Lozano Blesa University Clinical Hospital of Zaragoza, and he's also a professor at the University of Zaragoza in Spain. Thank you, Fernando, for joining us today.
Thank you to you. Thank you to you all.
And to anyone who's following the event either on Zoom or via the live stream on Twitter, you can send in your questions in Zoom to the chat department and on Twitter to the live stream post. And we will try to address your questions both during the event as well as the end of the event. And this event will be recorded and shared on the New Deal Twitter account after the event. The New Deal Twitter account is at New Deal EU. And to our speakers, if you have any questions or comments, want to comment on something that some of you have said, please raise your hand and I will give you a chance to speak up. Okay, well, first off, I'd like for you, our speakers, to give a brief introduction to your background and what kind of a relationship you have to today's topic. Please, Tina, you can start.
My name is Tina Aswani Omprakash. Thank you so much for having me here today, Kira. Like you said, I am the author of Own Your Crohn's, which is a blog and social media advocacy platforms on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, which really helps to empower patients with Crohn's disease specifically and life-saving ostomy surgery. I myself have had Crohn's disease for nearly 15 years. I've had a permanent ileostomy. This is my third one for the last 9 years. And I have been a part of a clinical trial and then a follow-up clinical trial, all related to ustekinumab and reinduction of ustekinumab. So I am thrilled to be here with you today. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk about my experiences.
Thank you so much, Tina. How about you, Alan? Could you tell us a bit about your background in pharmaceutical development, please?
Yes, okay, thanks very much. Yes, I trained in medicine and biochemistry many years ago, and as a postgraduate worked in hospital medicine and was specializing in clinical pharmacology. Now, I've been in the pharmaceutical industry, working in the industry as a pharmaceutical physician and a medical officer for the last 35 years through large pharma companies like Glaxo, ICI, Zeneca. I set up a biotech company in the late 90s to investigate the use of gene therapies and took the first gene therapy up to registration. And the last 15 years, I've run my consultancy advising small, large companies, universities to turn their research ideas into medicines. And clearly a key part of that is clinical trials. So I've spent, 35 years working in clinical trials in one form or another. And I brought about 16 medicines all the way through the process to become prescription medicines. So that's my expertise. And looking forward to the discussions today about the importance of clinical trials in development. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alan. And how about you, Fernando? Could you tell us a bit about your connections to IBD? How did you come to work with these diseases?
Well, my background in IBD is mostly clinical, because I am working in clinical IBD. Yes, also 35 years ago, I think. Was the first type of patients I could see, and I follow. I continue working on IBD, and of course I have experience in academic medicine because I am also working as a professor, and my experience with clinical trials is more limited than Alan's, but I have been working in clinical trials because we do participate in clinical trials, and we have patients in different types of clinical trials, from phase 3, phase 4, and so on. And we continue on doing that at our department now.
Great. Thank you so much for the introductions. Let's move on to today's topic in more detail. First, I'd like for us to talk a bit about the pharmaceutical development process in general. So, of course, what we usually see of medicines or treatments is basically the final product we can get at the hospital or the pharmacy, but the development process is, of course, a lot more complicated, and translating research into new treatments is a years-long journey that includes a lot of steps. So, Alan, could you briefly run us through the steps that a treatment has to go through before becoming available?
Yes, of course I will. So briefly, well, first of all, it takes on average about 10 years to turn that research idea into a prescription medicine. And it costs a lot of money. The figures are, some of the, particularly for a large clinical indication, it could cost anything up to £1 billion, which is an awful lot of money over the 10 years. And obviously we start off with the research and the research ideas, and we have to then make sure that the products and the ideas coming out of the research, we can actually develop that into a medicine of some kind. So in that stage, we'll do work in the laboratory. We'll have to, treat animal models of the disease to get some idea about the medicine and how it's given and how, those animals are responding to it. And then after that, we have to think about starting with the manufacture of the product, because we do have to deliver it in some way to the patient. So we have to think about how it's going to be made. Is it going to be a tablet? Is it an injection? Is it given some other way? And then start the preliminary manufacture. And once we've made some of that, we can then move to what we call the animal toxicology studies, because we do have to first of all expose it to animals first to make sure it's safe. And if there's anything we find from those animals, and we do limit the number of animals that we use. We don't like using too many animals, and as few as possible. But what we want to see from those animals is, first of all, is it having any adverse effects in those animals? And if it is, are they going to impact then later on when we give it to human beings? Because we do see things in animals that actually, depending upon the disease we're going to be treating, sometimes we can accept some adverse effects in the animals. And then when we've got that, we put that together with the manufacturer. We then design the first clinical study that's going to be used to give the treatment to humans. And then, sorry, my phone's buzzing. Let me turn it off. That's it. I do apologize. And we have to design that first study to go into humans. Now, with some medicines, we can start with volunteers. Others, we need to go straight to patients, depending upon the nature of the chemicals and the biological agents we're using. And then we go through 3 stages, really. We do early phase for what they call phase 1 studies in volunteers or early patients, and get those results. We see if the drug is overall, the first thing we look at, is it safe? Or is it causing adverse effects in the patients? And also if we can get an idea about, actually, is it going to work? Have we got some mechanism? Clearly, if we're in volunteers, you can't assess that. So it's pure predominantly safety. And we get those results. And then the next stage is the phase 2 studies, which are in patients, and again, with the disease, where we give the drug. And again, the focus is on safety. We also look at the blood levels and how the body is handling the drug, and then get some initial ideas about, is the drug working and treating that disease? These are, comparatively small studies, perhaps going up to about 200 people, depends on the indication. And then from that, we will have a good idea of the doses we're going to give, the safety profile of the drug in that patient population, and is it working? And then we move into what we call phase 3 studies, which are much larger studies in many more patients. And at this stage, we will probably do a control study, either against placebo with the treatment we want to develop versus placebo, or it may be an active control. It may be another treatment that we do that comparison. And these are much larger studies, and again, depending upon the indication, if it's a large indication like hypertension or asthma, then we may be into thousands of patients. So it depends on that. And what we're looking for is to confirm the safety of the product in that population, and also establish firmly, is it working? Establish the efficacy. And when we've got all that information, alongside, we will have continued with the manufacture, perhaps a few more toxicology studies with animals along the way. We put all that information together and then submit it to the regulators. So, that's fairly topical, I think, with all the news about the vaccines at the moment. The vaccines are at the stage, they've got some data, it's been made, they've done the animal studies. So they're putting all that information together now. And I do know, it's been declared publicly that the regulators are now starting to look at that package of data. So that's how we go through. And then the regulators review it and hopefully give you the thumbs up. Yes, it can become a prescription medicine. So it's a long story, but it takes a long time. So I'm happy to answer questions on that.
Great. Thank you so much for the explanation. Well, Tina, from the patient point of view, how well is this process known in the patient community? I understand that there might be some differences between the processes in the US and Europe, but what would you say regarding this?
I actually think it's fairly similar from my understanding of clinical trials in the US, but to be completely honest with you, I don't think that most patients know. I think that when I was going through this, I certainly did not know what phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 constitute. I think as a master's student in public health, I've come to learn that pretty quickly. But that's from a separate background, and also my own interest in clinical trials. I've come to learn that. But I think that this is where there's a key gap. There's a lack of patient education when it comes to clinical trials, whether it's around how they work, whether it's around how much money goes into this, and just how much research energy and active participation from pharmas and from regulatory agencies. And I don't think patients have any idea regarding all of this. And I would like to see in the upcoming years a lot more education on this, so that patients can understand how they can be active partners and be willing to contribute on this front.
Yeah, that's very, very important. Well, Fernando, how much of this process do you see at your work at the hospital, and how are you involved in this process?
Well, it depends on the hospital, and in my hospital we work in phase 3 trials. There are other hospitals working in phase 2 or even in phase 1, but these type of trials are very complicated, and you have to have a special facilities for that. And it's not our case. We work specifically in phase 3 trials, and in these trials, our implication is complete. It's from the start, because we have to offer the trial to the patient. We have to select the patients. We have to collaborate with the industry for the design of the protocol sometimes. And we go through all the process, treating the patient under the clinical trial conditions, and we review all the data, we report the side effects and so on. We do the clinical work of the trial, and we have to be very implicated with our patients in the trial. And I agree with Tina that in most cases, patients are not well informed about what is a clinical trial, because a clinical trial is very different from the press perspective, from the real perspective working on a clinical trial. And it's a very difficult concept to transmit sometimes to patients.
Yes, thank you so much, Fernando. Well, if we move on to talk about clinical trials more specifically, well, Tina, you've been through clinical trials yourself. So could you tell us a bit about the experience and how you came to make that decision to participate in this trial?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you're asking this question, because I think it's really very important for patients to share their experiences around this, because this kind of information is limited regarding clinical trial experience in patients. So I actually joined a clinical trial for ustekinumab 5.5 years ago. And it was actually not that easy to get into. I had had significant surgery. I have an ileostomy. I was out of options. I was being told in New York that they can get me on an off-label dose, because at that point in time, it had been approved for psoriasis, plaque psoriasis at a much lower dose. But I had surgery at the Mayo Clinic, and I had significant fistulization of my disease. So I had a brand new RV fistula, rectovaginal fistula. And at this time, the doctor there was one of the leads on the clinical trial, and he wanted me to join that. He's like, I'm sorry, but I don't think the lower dose is going to cut it for you. So he actually put me on the 90 milligrams every 8 weeks back in summer of 2015. So more than a year prior to it being approved. And it was coordinated locally with my hospital in New York, which was a whole process as well. And what that required was, initially I just got injections. It has since been approved with infusions. The first loading dose is an infusion. And I think one of the ways that, my doctors learned from my case was they saw that how long it took for the injection to start working in me. So it was approved with an infusion, which shows faster sort of response, clinical response to ustekinumab nowadays. So that's how I originally got involved, and it was pretty robust. My care was very robust, and I think this is one of the ways that we can certainly allow clinical trials to shine, is that you get such robust care and medical management. So I was going for weekly appointments, weekly iron infusions, yes, but more so than that, blood draws. I was having colonoscopies, well, ileoscopies for me, more regularly, MRIs, and we actually did see several months into me starting the ustekinumab, I was also put on antibiotics and an immunosuppressant, azathioprine, side by side, because it was unknown at the time whether or not ustekinumab would, whether or not I would develop antibodies to it. There wasn't enough data. So I was put on this cocktail of medications, and within several months, that last fistula closed and there was no disease activity showing. So this was the first time in 10 years I was considered in remission. And we saw over the next several months that I head into endoscopic remission. And so I was followed pretty closely, and we sort of staggered off from weekly to biweekly and then to monthly appointments. And I believe a little over a year later, that medication was approved, like I said, with an infusion loading dose. About a year and a half ago, I was back at Mayo Clinic because I was having a flare-up, and I also developed a disease called gastroparesis, which they diagnosed. And at that time, it was decided that perhaps I was starting to lose response to ustekinumab. So there was a POWER study. It's a clinical trial that reinduces ustekinumab in patients who are starting to see a loss of response. So I was brought back to New York, and in New York, my doctor here again coordinated to make sure that I could get that reinduction loading dose. Of course, there was the possibility of a placebo in that, from what I understand, but I do believe after 3 weeks or so, I had an MRI and it was clear that it was working, whatever the case was. So I have participated in these two clinical trials, and I have seen, for the first time in my life, quality of life. So I have a very positive story to share with regards to this, and I can't speak more highly of being able to get my life back, but also being able to share what clinical trials can do for patients with Crohn's and colitis.
Thank you for sharing that experience. Did you have any doubts, concerns before you entered that trial? Could you tell a bit about them?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question in the sense that, of course, I had doubts. I think we all do. I think at that point in my journey, though, I was pretty much like, I have tried every biologic, I have tried every medication that's available to me. And unfortunately, I think that's what happens. We're kind of pushed up against a wall. And don't feel like we have very many options. And quite frankly, living with a fistula, let alone the 6 that I had over a course of several years is not a joke. Patients want quality of life, and I think that needs to be addressed. For me, I was actually offered ustekinumab earlier in my journey, back in, I believe, late 2009 or early 2010, when it had first come out, and it was offered. I've had pretty easy access to clinical trials if I wanted them, because I've gone to research hospitals mostly for my care, so academic centers, where they have lead clinicians on some of these trials. So it was offered to me, but it was offered to me when I had a J pouch. I was originally diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, and I had severe refractory pouchitis. So it was actually offered to me at that time, and I could not wrap my head around the fact that this was such a new medication. There was literally no data on it, but certainly no data on pouchitis, but on Crohn's, and it was being tested for Crohn's at the time. So I was like, I did not feel very comfortable at that point in my journey, but I think that was because I was lacking the education around clinical trials. And I think I can't emphasize that enough, how much we have to educate, whether it's understanding the stages of it, how much testing has already been done by the time it gets to a patient. Those laboratory models are extremely important for patients to understand what's being done in the background, because if we have no idea of that, we think we're the guinea pigs in the process. So, and also patients aren't really, patients don't really feel comfortable, because they're feeling like, this is a completely brand new medication and it's being tested on me. But what we're not thinking about oftentimes is, how is this contributing to the future? If we don't have people participating in this, we're not going to have the new medications in the next several years. So these are all things that I think need to be reframed and talked about more so in terms of education.
Right, thank you. And actually, we've had quite a few audience questions related to the topic. Probably a patient is asking, how will my safety be protected if I participate in a clinical trial? So Fernando or Alan, would you like to comment on this?
I think the safety of the patient is very protected in the clinical trial, because first, we have the standards of our care in IBD, and the standards of care in IBD in Europe, and I think also in the USA, are very high now. And so first we have the standards, the normal care, and second, in the clinical trial, the standards are more exigent. You need to adapt to very, very high standards, ethical standards, clinical standards, and you have to report any side effect to the central committee. If the side effect is severe, you have to do the report in just 24 hours, and it's all very, very controlled in the clinical trial. And I think that Alan can comment on it, that previously to the clinical encounter with the patient, the drug has passed so many filters that safety is very, very guaranteed. Of course, you are proving a new thing, and biology is so complex that anything can occur, but this is life, of course, and you will not find so a controlled atmosphere in life, environment in life, as a clinical trial, I think.
Alan, would you like to comment on this? You're actually muted, so just a second and we'll fix that. Sorry.
And Kira, if I could comment after Alan.
Of course. Would you like to start as we're fixing the microphone problem?
Yeah, that's it. That's
okay. There we go.
I went on mute because I was coughing and didn't want to, but then I couldn't get off mute again. So that's fine. Yeah, I mean, in terms of safety, as I said, we when we move from the animal stage and the research stage, we've got some idea from the animals what the adverse events might be, and they're called what we call signals. So, for instance, if they might have affected your liver, the animals might have affected. So when we go into a clinical study with humans, we monitor the liver very carefully and do tests. So we have some idea. But as Fernando says, moving from animals to humans, in humans, the safety profile may be very different. So we have to monitor the patients very carefully. And you will have noticed that when I talked about the development of a drug, everything first was safety, safety, safety. It's very important. So when we start off with the first studies, of course, we know, our safety profile, we just don't know, to be honest, but we have an idea. And particularly, for instance, if other medicines in that same class of drugs have been into humans, we can get some idea from that. But if it's a totally new treatment regime and a totally new drug that's never been into humans, we have to be extremely careful. And as Fernando said, we do monitor that. Everything gets reported. Anything that happens to the patient, whether the patient or the doctor thinks it's related to the drug. I have a great example of an early phase study we were doing, and I had a report of a donkey bite. Okay, and the patient had been bitten by a donkey. Now, it's nothing to do with the drug or the process at all, but we had to report that as an adverse event to that patient. Okay, so that's just an extreme. But of course, we gather all the other information and gradually build up the story. And develop the safety profile, and that's what we do call about signals. And if we start to see an increase, say in cough, or whatever the incidence is of a particular product, or vomiting, nausea, then we'll take that into account. And as we move from one phase to the other, we will let those patients say, been in the phase 1. Going into phase 2, we will let those patients know what side effects and adverse effects have been seen in the previous work, and that will be put in the consent form and will be laid out very clearly to the patient who's volunteering for the study to say, look, so far we've seen these adverse effects, and this is what might happen in the future. So it's all about that and gathering that information. And then at the end of the development, we have to then look at all the safety. And then decide, is that safety profile acceptable to that patient population? So for instance, if we're treating patients with end-stage pancreatic cancer, those patients will tolerate a lot more side effects than if we're treating, a new headache treatment or a pain treatment for a 3-year-old. It's very different. So that's how we assess it. It's called benefit risk. So that's how we put it together. Okay, does that help?
Yes, Tina, would you like to comment on that?
Sure, that was a great explanation. I think from a personal point of view, I don't think I ever felt safer than when I actually was in the trial, because I was so closely monitored all the time. And like I was saying earlier, I had weekly appointments. So anything comes up, I was reporting to my doctor. So I had neuropathy at the time and was sent for electromyography for EMG. We weren't sure if it was related to the ustekinumab. It was reported to the FDA. I faced constipation. We now know it's probably from IBS and gastroparesis, but at the time, I definitely saw some constipation. This can happen, from what I understand, with biologic treatments, especially if you're going from significant diarrhea to much slower sort of bowel movements. That was another thing we reported. So, it was very, very, I felt very safe in the process because my doctors were following me like a hawk. So, and I think that to me, I did not realize that going into it, but coming out of it, I was like, if I had to do this again, I probably would, because I felt like I was getting the best care I'd ever gotten.
Yeah. And if I could just add something, Kira, actually just participating in a clinical trial, there is a lot of evidence now to show that actually patients will get better just because of their participation in the trial, because they're looked after more. And it's a psychological effect, which is actually why we use placebos, and dummy tablets, because of that placebo effect of being in a clinical trial versus, the active treatment. So it's good for patients to get in clinical trials. And, my sort of mantra is, if you can get in a clinical trial anywhere, then go for it and do it, because it'll be good for you as an individual, and also to the whole being able to treat the disease, and you'll probably get some benefit out of it too.
Okay.
Fernando, if you've got a similar impression from the patients that you've treated.
Yes, and I would like to add one more thing, is that when you are doing a clinical trial, you are the clinician in front of a patient, but always there is an external committee only working on safety, and they are monitoring data on safety, and they have all the power to interrupt the trial if anything is going wrong. And they are independent people. I have been working as independent committee in a recent clinical trial in IBD, and we were surprised because everything was so okay that we analyzed it point by point, any minimal point, as Tina has said, and anything was considered as a possible effect, and everything was considered by an independent committee, not implicated in the trial. And this is not very well known by many patients, as there is an independent external committee evaluating everything in the trial.
Yes, no, it's a good point, actually. Very good point.
Thank you. And we received another question, quote, assume if I choose to volunteer in a clinical trial, sorry, I was reading from another part. What questions should I ask before deciding if I want to take part in a clinical trial? What would you say to that? Maybe Tina, have you any suggestions?
Absolutely. First of all, in the US especially, and I don't know how this works abroad, but we have clinicaltrials.gov. I oftentimes in my journey with Crohn's disease, I have looked on that website to see what clinical trials are available to me. There are other third-party sites. I actually have a clinical trial finder on my own website to help patients find them if they are interested. But I would suggest, like, if you are interested in a clinical trial, look into what's available, depending on which country you're in, because obviously it might be different based on your location. And I would bring that up to your doctor if your doctor hasn't brought it up to you already, and have that conversation. See if they've had any experience, one, with clinical trials, two, with that particular medication, and what they have seen, what they haven't seen. There's things that they can and can't disclose at that time based on what their findings are, and based on where that trial is, which phase it's in, and if it's been reported yet. So keep all these things in mind. But I definitely think it's worth having that conversation with your doctor. I mean, I have this conversation fairly often. What's my next option? Should I lose response? It's a fair question to ask. It's a realistic question to ask of our doctors, is what sort of do you have in mind as the next option for me? And I would definitely have that conversation about, that risk benefit that Ellen was mentioning, and see, if you feel comfortable doing that clinical trial in your own IBD center, or if there is maybe a different facility where your doctor can refer you to have those conversations, and also to have that clinical trial coordinated, because it could be done outside your hospital as well.
Yeah.
Alan, any comments?
Yes, if I could just add to that. I mean, Tina mentioned clinicaltrials.gov, which is actually a very important website. And there is a regulatory requirement actually for any study that's being conducted anywhere in the world, then it should be listed on one of these clinical trial registries, and the commonest one is clinicaltrials.gov. So they're all there, because if you don't register it, it's very difficult then to get it reviewed and publish the results in journals. There's an equivalent European database, but the other places to look for clinical trials, as Tina suggested, is patient advocacy groups with where they've got on their website, and also the disease charities. So they often list where clinical studies are ongoing, particularly in their own countries. So that's a good place to look. In terms of what people should ask for, when you're entering a clinical trial, they will give you a consent form and information about the study and what's involved. And the key things I think you should look, we should be asking for is, what is the drug? Is there a control? Am I going to be randomized to the treatment or the control, which is very important? How does it work? What's it going to do to me? What other studies have been carried out with it? What's the safety profile so far? What are the risks? What are the benefits likely to be? And then finally, the design of the study and what's going to happen to me in those studies. So how many assessments, how many, MRI scans, how many blood tests and things like that. And is it all done in the hospital, or is some going to be allowing me to do that at home? And, how is the treatment going to be given? Is it an injection? Is it a tablet? Those sort of things. So, and I'm sure Fernando has other things to say because I know, Fernando, you'll be giving those consent forms to patients, won't you? And
yes, I have. The problem is that consent forms sometimes are so extensive that very difficult to understand for patients. So they need the consult from the physician. And I think there's a person very important in our unit is the nurse, the research nurse, because she in our case is Erika, and she is very she feels very near to the patient. She's very and she understands very well the need of the patients, and she has the time to address these issues, because in clinical practice we have a problem with time. Time is very difficult to obtain. You don't have time. You don't have enough time for teaching, for clinical care, and for everything. And in clinical trials, you need time, because the patient has many doubts and so on. And so I think the questions you have put are very important. But every patient is a different person and feels different things. So you need to be very personal, and sometimes you need a bit more of time to be more personal with patients.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Now, one other thing, Kira, I wanted to add is I think it's very important, from first glance to ask some of those questions, from second glance when you have the consent form to ask some of the questions that Ellen and Fernando were talking about, but also, the biggest thing patients have a concern about are what are their rights in this trial. And I've heard this a lot is, am I locked into this? Is this some kind of binding contract? And it generally isn't. You are, allowed to back out of it if it's not suiting your purposes and if it's not something you can commit to at this time. The other thing that patients often don't realize, and this is a big positive in the US, I know patients who have gone into trials simply because they have mild to moderate disease and cannot afford their care. This gives, whether or not this is the right way to approach it, but this gives them free care and access to a brand new treatment and allows them to actually change and forge the way that IBD is going to be treated. So I've heard from patients who've actually talked about it like this too. I'm getting free access to care. Everything's being monitored. Plus the medication is free. Plus I'm able to sort of change the way the world looks at IBD and perhaps help forge a new path to how it's being treated.
Great, thank you. And another question that we've already shortly discussed or heard from you about the consent form. So there was a question related to that. So as we're talking about novel technologies, that it's hard to at this point say what the short term or the longer term consequences might be, as in the case of New Deal and the treatments that are developed in the project. So how can you create transparency in the consent form regarding these kind of cases? Alan, what would you say?
Yes, and that's a good question, particularly with some of the newer therapies, the advanced therapies that we're dealing with, and of course the New Deal therapy is one of those. The New Deal treatment we're doing is taking what we call siRNA. It's part of the DNA protein production cycle, but we're using a chemical that and a structure that will actually inhibit the JAK kinase. It's an SIR inhibitor of JAK kinase, which is one of the inflammatory chemicals that causes problems in IBD. And the way we're giving that is it's going to be delivered in a nanoparticle, hopefully, and it's eventually will be an oral therapy. Now we know about the short-term effects, but of course we don't know about the longer-term effects with that. So that has to be taken into account by the patient. Now, again, when we've studied animals, usually we've studied some of the, depending on how often the tablet's going to be given and the duration of that treatment, we will treat animals in a similar way. So if you're going to be on a chronic, if it's going to be a chronic treatment, i.e. it's given, repeatedly over a period, we will have taken animal studies out to perhaps a year, where we've dosed the animals every day just to see what happens. But again, as I've said, sometimes animals are very different from humans. So it's all part of the risk assessment. But what we do is we will follow patients up for a lot longer. So you've been in the study, and particularly with these new therapies that are coming out, we will have follow-on protocols. So they will finish that one clinical study, but then be entered into a follow-on protocol where we continually look at the safety aspects and how these patients are doing on this treatment if they continue it. And even when a drug gets approved, we will have perhaps only studied a few thousand patients. And we only learn more about the drug through these, post-approval studies. I describe it as a bit like learning to drive a car, in that when you learn to drive a car, you take lessons and it gets you through your driving test. And then afterwards, you learn how to drive your car because you know all about it. And actually, it's the same with drug development. When we get a drug approved, we know about its safety, but not all of it. And so that's when we can road test it and put it into more patients and gather that information. And that's what builds, the profile of the drug in a longer term. But so that's what we do. But as I say, the individual patient, I think, has to think about, okay, this is what's known now. We don't know about that. Am I willing to, to participate with that unknown risk with there? But you continue to be looked after. That's the important thing.
That's great. Thank you. And Fernando, to you as a doctor, you probably have suggested for people to join a clinical trial at some point. So when would you recommend for a patient to join a trial?
It's very different because in many situations, because it depends on the type of trial. If you are studying a very, very new drug, you only recommend the trial to patients in very desperate situation, as Tina was before taking ustekinumab, for instance, no? But if in many cases, the trials are for those patients not responding to a standard treatment, and you think they can benefit from this new drug, new approach to the treatment of the disease. It's a bit complicated because you have to guess if this patient will get better from this new drug, and you are in some kind of thing, you are guessing in some kind of things. So it's very difficult. For us, it's very compromised ethically, because you have to be very careful of recommending that, because in some way, sometimes you could have an interest in this, because clinical trials bring money to the departments also. And so you have to consider the patient's view. And I think transparency is key. And transparency is key in all the things about the trial. In fact, when we receive money for doing a trial, I tell to the patient, this trial is coming money from that trial for our department and so on, because we have to be very transparent. To transmit the information is not so easy. It's very difficult, because in many cases, these consent forms, by legal reasons, are so difficult to understand, even for a physician. You read this, and many times you have to stop to understand what the consent form is saying. So I think we have to advance in the knowledge of the patients. I think Tina and patients advocacy groups should do a lot of work in that, for improving transparency and comprehension of these problem. And I think we should normalize clinical trials. Clinical trials are a part of clinical activities. And when we have to normalize to introduce the clinical trial as a normal thing in our current, in our clinical activities. But to do so, we need help because we don't know exactly what patient knows about a clinical trial. We need help from patients. In fact, just 2 years ago in our ECHO meeting, in European Crohn's and Colitis Organization meeting, in our annual meeting, the best conference was given by a patient. And the patient explained to us all her life through a very complicated Crohn's disease, and in fact, several clinical trials. And it was a complete, all the physicians after the talk were not only clapping, but crying, because this type of information is very important for us to design new clinical trials and consent forms. And we need patience for that.
Yeah. Fernando, I'd entirely agree with you. I mean, I've written many consent forms, but the problem is, I think, here we are, medical people, scientists and medics, we write them in our language, and that's not appropriate for the patients. So I would be very keen to involve patients much more in drafting these documents. And I know, there's a movement anyway in the industry to get more patient involvement, but I think that's very important. And the other thing, I mean, from a personal experience, I many years ago, working, writing the assessments into studies like an MRI scan. And I would glibly, quite say, yes, do an MRI scan every month and things like this. And then I actually had an MRI scan, a whole body MRI scan, and it was a horrible experience for me. I felt like I was being buried alive. And so from that, I think very carefully now from a patient perspective, what am I asking them to do? Because, and it's these sort of things I think that we need, as a medical profession, we need to take into account and make sure we're not putting patients through things that, we just wouldn't do ourselves. That's important, I think.
And Fernando, you mentioned the role of patient advocates. And Tina, as you are both a patient and a patient advocate, what would you say about the advocate's role in this? Should they be more involved in clinical trial advisement and driving solutions for better clinical trial engagement?
Absolutely, and I really appreciate both of you, recognizing how important the patient voice is in this. Having spoken at conferences, shared, especially like aspects of my fistula story that were very jarring to me, kind of had the same kind of response. I think it's really, really important for clinicians and patients to work together with industry, with GI psychologists, with GI dietitians, the whole multidisciplinary team to really understand what a toll this disease is taking on the patient. I think that's the first step. Leading into a clinical trial, we really need to understand what is this disease doing to the patient physically, yes, but emotionally also. So one of the things that I do in one of the hats that I have as a patient advocate is I work a lot with pharmaceuticals in clinical trial advisement. So how I've been involved has been mainly around unmet needs for patients and what sort of language marketing around clinical trials. But I really think we need to be involved from the very beginning, whether it's drafting those consent forms, helping with that process, but also I think we need to put a face on these clinical trials as well. So one of the things I'm working on is, certain advertisements even, or social media posts that show this is a patient that's been on a clinical trial. If she can do it, and if she can share her experiences, this doesn't have to be so scary. I think there's aspects to that that are very beneficial, but also hearing the patient's story via video, via blog posts, via articles, what have you, I think is very important. But I also think that patients really, really need to be involved at the table with patient advocacy groups and with doctors. And that's something that I've been trying to work more and more towards is helping to make sure we're involved in the trial design as well. What is that going to look like? What are the endpoints going to look like? Because after all, even if we can get a clinical response, that may not be enough for a patient who's suffering from fistulas or strictures. Having a response is one thing, yes, but being able to regain some quality of life from perhaps that fistula stopping to drain, or perhaps, that stricture not closing up your intestines so much. I think all these things are really, really important to consider. What endpoints are you considering? Are they actually plausible for a patient? Also, there's a lot of exclusionary criteria in clinical trials, patient with ostomy, patient with J-pouch. It's often very hard for patients who've had surgery get in. I would like to see us work together to see if there's certain arms that we can create maybe to the trial, maybe later on, prior to approval, that where we can start including more surgical patients so that we can start getting a little bit of data on that as well. I would like to see a little bit more flexibility in some of these clinical trials to make them more feasible for patients to join and more attractive for patients to join as well, who may not be completely out of options, may not be desperate, but might be excited to say, maybe I should give this a try. Maybe I can change things, or maybe I am a good candidate because I can do things to change the way science is done. I know for me, that's very important. That's one of the reasons why I took part in that ustekinumab reinduction trial. Whether or not I felt like I was at the end of my rope, no, I didn't. But I also did know that proactive disease monitoring, being on top of my disease, is very, very important. So it was something that was very important for me to get involved in. I wasn't quite at that desperate state yet. So I think that kind of education and involvement of patient advocates is very much necessary from start to finish with these clinical trials. Of course, when the final product is ready to launch, I think that's key. I've been involved in that. But I think we need a lot more robust involvement of patient thought leaders in these discussions throughout.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that perhaps would be good to happen. I mean, as you're aware, Tina, we have to put a lot of information and documents together for the clinical trial to get it approved, both by the regulatory agencies like the FDA and the MHRA here in London, but also the ethics committees and the institutional review boards. Perhaps an additional piece of information we should be submitting is quite a simple thing like, well, has you had patient input into this study? Absolutely. And should it be yes or no? And if it's no, then perhaps the ethics committees shouldn't be looking at it, and the IRBs. It's perhaps a big step to convince the world, but perhaps that's something we should be thinking about.
Absolutely. I can definitely see some IRBs in the US considering things like that, because they are starting to recognize how important patient involvement is in these kinds of endeavors. So I appreciate you saying that.
Mm. I'll see what I can do, with the powers that be. No promise.
Fantastic to me.
Wonderful. Well, before we wrap up the discussion, one more audience question at this point. So regarding the placebo arm that we briefly discussed before. So what's your opinion regarding the placebo arm in IBD clinical trials? Fernando, would you like to comment on this?
I think a placebo is needed in some trials, but we should use less often. I think a placebo should be substituted for any other thing, active drugs or active procedures in many times. And I think in some trials, I really do not understand why there is a placebo arm. For me, sometimes it's incredible, because we insist in placebo by methodological reasons, but not for real science reasons. And the very important point is not only the patient's perspective, as Tina has very clearly shown us, but also if we really need placebo to demonstrate something when we have an active treatment as comparator. So we should always think we could compare this new drug with the old drug, and we need really placebo? And this is a very important question. Maybe as Alan has said, with the patient's implication in the design, the ethics committee should also question, do you really need placebo? And if they don't get a real explanation, a clear explanation, the ethics of the trial should be considered. And placebo is very difficult to introduce in many trials because you are considering the trial for a very complicated patient. Really, you are offering placebo to a very complicated patient? It would not be better to offer at least the standard of treatment for the control group, because in some cases, of course, we need placebo in some small populations in the first trials, of course, but we should minimize placebo, in my opinion.
I would have to agree with that. I couldn't agree more. I would like to see more of the head-to-head sort of study design, and see, now that we have a whole arsenal of medications, biologic small molecules available to patients, why not have that be the control group? I think that makes a lot more sense, because that is probably, between that and the exclusion criteria, I think those are the two biggest turnoffs for patients in joining a clinical trial. Is the placebo arm. They don't know if they're going to get the medication, which means, running to the bathroom 40 times a day again. It's not a pleasant life. It means, you can't work, you can't go to school, you can't do so many of the things that make you feel whole. But also, I think if there could be a control with, some of the existing drugs, and that way we get data on whether patients do well, being anti-TNF naive or not. We get lots of data from doing trials like that. So I would like to see more of that. And I think that would be more plausible for patients as well. I also think it would be interesting if, like Fernando was saying about the placebo arm maybe being in some of the earlier trials, or if we were to maybe stratify in the sense that look at more mild to moderate patients, but the ones who are in the more severe category, perhaps they get the control group with medications that already exist right now, so that they're being treated with something. I would like to see more of that, more sort of groups of different classifications of this disease and how they're being treated. And I think that will give more robust data too on how the medication's working in different groups of disease.
Great, thank you. As we're running out of time, I would like for each of you to give your final takeaways for patients watching this event right now. So in 30 seconds, what should they make of clinical trials? So Alan, would you like to start?
Yeah, as I've said, patients can benefit just from taking part in a clinical trial. So I would encourage every patient where they can get into a clinical trial.
That was brief. Thank you. Dina, how about you?
I think I would say something similar in the sense that, you know what, we have to give these things a chance in the sense that we could really be pushing science forward. Think about it. If you had a family member in these shoes, or if you had a friend in these shoes, would you want them to receive the treatment or not? I think it's important to recognize we are the drivers of our own care when it comes to clinical trials. We are really making our own future, and we are making a future and forging a path for patients who will be newly diagnosed with IBD or who are moving on to newer treatments. So think about all these things when you're considering a clinical trial.
Thanks. How about Fernando? Last words.
Yes, as I have said before, I think we should consider clinical trials as a normal part, an usual part of our everyday working in our IBD units. And I think we should agree with patients for doing better clinical trials, because it's the only way to really have good information. And information is key for the future. We need good information, and good information is obtained only in well-designed clinical trials. This is very, very important for the future of the IBD patients.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tina, Fernando, and Alan, for joining us today to discuss these really, really extremely important topics. And thank you also to everyone who's been watching via Zoom and Twitter. The event recording will be shared on the New Deal Project's Twitter account at New Deal EU. And you can also read more about New Deal at the project website at newdeal-project.eu. Thank you so much, and see you at the next IBD and Tea event.
Much everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.